Archibald!
Good evening, Legionaries. This is General Lance, as always, with Sergeant Barnes, and today we have a special guest, NAMOR. Today we actually have a very interesting topic of discussion, which have been brought up, obviously, with the looming presence of near-peer and peer adversaries duking it out on the battlefield on a multi-domain advanced warfare platform. But without further ado, welcome, NAMOR. How are you?
Hey, fine, brother. Thanks for having me. How's everything on your end?
Doing magnificent. Thank you so much. Well, I think I just wanted to basically give the Legionnaires out there a reason why we're sharing this transmission. You see, the future for us is not like the last, I guess, let's say 30 years, really. The United States hasn't battled a near-peer adversary in a very long time, or a competent one for an extended period of time. And as we saw in the Ukraine, many of us thought that Russia was a pushover. Still further, we have seen with increasing alarm the PRC, the PLA, Army, Navy, and so on, armed forces in general, proliferate in capable combined arms formations. You see them doing expeditionary warfare, extending their power abroad, effectively becoming a professional force at a peer level capacity. Obviously, they're still unbloodied necessarily, but I guess it kind of begs the question, right? Is basically we have to ask ourselves, what does a war like World War II look like for us nowadays, right? What does it look like? Does it look like Ukraine and so on? And ultimately, every war, for good or for ill, is decided in that last football field distance of combat, right? So within 100 meters of the enemy, you have to find, fix, flank, and finish them. But without further ado, I just wanted to introduce that topic and get your first cursory thoughts, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah. Well, I would like to lead off with, this topic and the nature of men and organizations that are contained in this book. It's not for everybody. This is definitely something very exclusive, and you have to be willing to step into this arena and give everything for that guy on your left and your right. All too often, we see these stalwart heroes online, reading and writing until they break their phones or computers. You're not going to find that in this book. The Gunny, it places a lot of emphasis. You see the theme throughout all 400 pages of it. Getting out and doing. And, this isn't something that you can do with the homies. It isn't something that you can do in your spare time recreationally. It's a profession of arms for a reason. And we have to take it serious because, like you said, those last 100 meters, the last 100 yards, that's the crucial point. And, maintaining, any advantages you have or seizing advantages in order to, find, fix, and finish.
Exactly. And I guess for those of you who haven't read the book, ultimately it's a cursory overview of effectively combat on a peer-to-peer adversary, so basically two evenly matched opponents within that meeting, right, that fray. So it goes all the way back to, I think, the Revolutionary War, really the early modern period, and extends all the way into the modern day. And for him, when he was writing it, it was during GWAT, so Fallujah, think that. But it's what is interesting to me, and I guess I wanted to ask you, is why is there such an emphasis? Why is it that the author, and I mean, especially if you remember from your time and my time, there is such an emphasis on the basics, the fundamentals of warfare taught at the platoon squad level, has
Hmm.
always been on how do you say, opponent to opponent, close quarters combat type scenarios. Why don't you just give a background as far as why is that so important, and why is it such an important thing? Because I know many of you may think to yourself, of course it's important. You have to grab the enemy. But you'd be surprised because back in the 50s, we thought that nuclear weapons would solve it all. And then, of course, technology would solve it all. And then today,
Hmm.
there are still further idiots that are thinking, UAVs are going to solve it all. And it's just like, no, dude, like, that's not. War is always won with a dude and a gun or a weapon in his hand fighting another dude with a weapon in his hand, and that's unfortunately for them. I mean, I think that's part of the deal of war is that that's how at base what it is fundamentally, right? It's a clash of
Hmm.
wills. But why don't you talk about the emphasis? Why it's so important to talk about this fray? Why is it talk about this specific area or subject matter?
Yeah, certainly. So the gunny, H.J. Poole, he talks about in the beginning of the book how the American military is terrible at capturing lessons learned in after action reports, the AARs. So this was kind of like his, the culmination of his time as an instructor in Marine Corps infantry at various levels, his combat time in Vietnam, and then collecting all of these stories from himself and his guys, and even he was so prolific in the Corps. He even affected the officers above him, to include flag officers. The forward is written by an '06, and he uses this book to capture everything that he saw and everything he instructed. Like this was his after action report because he saw how negligent America was in understanding and breaking down, but also providing solutions to make sure that America has the ability to win in the future. It's littered with all kinds of dichotomies. He's a very straightforward writer. It's very specific, when and where to use certain types of ideas, and ultimately it is something that he just if I had a highlighter on, I would highlight every single word in this book. I don't think there's anything superfluous in this. It's a gunnery sergeant wrote this, right?
Right.
He's not an officer. He's not an officer. He's not a junior Marine. Everything is very poignant and serves a purpose in his capturing of what war is, what it takes to win, and make sure you achieve victory in those last 100 yards, whether that's through combined arms or whether, if you're just, a good old fashioned, infantry platoon and you just have, rifle guys and a weapons platoon.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing is, when I wrote my book, same thing, and I think military writing can be jading to certain people, but for me, it's always refreshing because it's the straight facts, right? And when you're on campaign, there are a few books that you want to have on hand if you have the luxury, right? Because ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain. But if you have the luxury of having a book and somehow you manage to have it, this is one of those books, right? Because it's almost like having, freaking MCDP 1 TAC 3 tactics, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's never going to go out of style, and it's always going to be helpful for you. It's going to be helpful to lead your team to understand the tactical circumstance. But these last 100 yards exactly the kind of I guess this is one of those books that you want to have on hand, and it's like the Bible. You're going to freaking read that thing over and over again. You're going to make sure you memorize that shit, and then you're going to memorize it again. Because, again, it's always straightforward information. It is precipitated, no BS language, no flourishes, no weird filler words, fluff, no fluff, just straight facts,
Mm-hmm.
things that you need to know. Well,
Hmm.
without further ado, why don't we just go into the first topic, which is what is the first critical aspect that Gunny tells us that we should focus on?
Okay, so the first one, and he does this by dichotomies, which I mentioned earlier. So his first thing is the emphasis of the different types of warfare, and we see various little uprisings of it throughout history, but in particular, which he cites in this, the dynamic that you measure warfare is attrition warfare versus maneuver warfare. So much of the classical world, really, even like after the invention of the firearm, um, there is what everybody has seen on the History Channel, the red blocks versus the blue blocks, and they get out on a agreed field of battle at an agreed time, and then it's like, okay, who's drilled the best, which army is best disciplined, who makes use of the terrain and wins through attrition. And even there might be some slight maneuver, but it's still attrition warfare. Like big armies go for a decisive battle then and there. Comparatively, and you'll have to forgive me. I forget what he uses as kind of like the shifting point. I think World War One. That recently, but then he gets into maneuver warfare. And he references a lot like the Germans and talking about them, and they really revolutionized that. And we can get into that later. But yeah, in particular, like maneuver warfare was the game changer. So of course, a lot of guys are going to think, oh yeah, well if some dude is running straight at me, I'm going to sidestep him and hit him from the side. Okay, yeah, cool, dude. Like you understand the principle of maneuver warfare. However, it becomes inextricably complicated when you talk about combined arms efforts or guerrilla warfare. Like how do you go and apply maneuver warfare in all these different scenarios now post World War One?
Yeah, I mean, I think people also they don't understand this basic concept, right? So it's Little Heart is one of my favorite reads ever, but again, he's not as succinct and concise as Gunny is, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the important thing to re-emphasize is the fact that there's positional warfare, right? And which is of course static, or what you would call, attritional warfare. So you're trying to attrit the enemy and destroy his capacity to basically not simply fight, but also impose his will upon you, but also maneuver, right? And the idea with maneuver is that you're searching for you're searching for gaps in the enemy's surfaces. And the first concept in which this was expounded is this term called Schwerpunkt, right? Which is the idea that you concentrate all your forces at the place where there is a comparative weakness in the enemy line. Now, this means different things for different people. But what the idea is to leverage asymmetries. And what does that mean necessarily, right? We don't know what this means, right? So what's an asymmetry? It's basically not necessarily that you have to be overall bigger than your enemy. Like, for instance, think about Thermopylae, right? The 300 Spartans against the huge army. Well, what happens is when the Spartans use a canalizing feature, geographic feature, terrain feature, to make sure that the enemy is basically prevented from exerting their center of gravity, which is their superior numbers. Basically, the Spartans win, right? What is maneuver warfare? Well, maneuver warfare is when the Persians take, Ephialtes betrays the Spartans, talks about the path behind the hot gates, and then the Persians are able to outmaneuver them and flank them and basically render their canalizing terrain feature null, right? So what does this
Mm-hmm.
mean? It means basically maneuver warfare is the idea of setting your strengths in such a way that you're able to render the enemy's strengths as a weakness or to
Mm-hmm.
nullify it or whatever. And so in the last 100 yards, like, people misunderstand. You can defeat a numerically superior enemy with superior aggression and superior localized force. And so what does that mean? It's like you may have, like, let's say you have a football team, right? You got two
Mm-hmm.
football teams on the freaking field, but your team is like, I don't know, let's say like 10 guys down or whatever, 5 guys down, right? However, you can push a localized tactical superior force in a specific area by basically aggregating all your forces on the weakest point of the enemy's defense. If you're able to do that, you're able to have actual operational and strategic victory simply by pushing that advantage. Now, back over to you. Obviously, we talk about the types of war, but what's the next point that he goes on to?
So the next part is he goes over kind of the anatomy of a small unit victory, and to the credit of what you just said, he often addresses and returns to the cost of winning. Like, you can win, but no matter what you do, there's going to be a cost to it. So is the cost going to be, do you want a few well trained? Or, is the cost going to be, well, I'm just going to have a large number of guys and I'm going to throw them at the objective. And so, getting into his, kind of the cost of winning, there's a wonderful chart that he has, and I'm just going to, I'll breeze through it. But it's worth reading verbatim, so bear with me. So this table is called "What May Be Required to Win at Low Cost," which is another dichotomy he addressed. You can win, but you need to balance: are you winning at high cost or are you winning at low cost? And so these are the parameters that he sets if you want to win at low cost. Number one, just defeating an enemy minimally takes the following: A, tactics, sub-bullets, some tactical knowledge, accurate assessment of the initial situation, logical decision-making, decisiveness, a localized combat power advantage, some semblance of control. B, logistical assets. C, personnel assets, the will to fight, some training, teamwork, some leadership. 2, for winning at low cost, there are additional requirements. A, under tactics, state-of-the-art tactical knowledge, authority to make common sense decisions at every echelon within the unit, minimizing the numbers of actions taken without thinking, allowing subordinates to obey human survival instincts, flexibility to an ever-changing situation, making as small a target as possible, consistently surprising the enemy, exploiting success to keep the foe off balance, momentum. And that's going to be an important thing for later, momentum. And finally, C, under personnel assets. Well-focused personnel, troops with the movement skills to utilize existing cover, troops with the shooting skills to cover the movement of others by fire when necessary, specialized training for those who need it to survive, enough trained personnel to rotate dangerous billets, appropriate assignment of personnel, pairing up of personnel as with policemen, and finally, a leadership style that permits subordinates to react quickly to unforeseen dangers.
Exactly. I mean, why don't you go ahead and tell us what comes to mind when you think of these topics? What it is that you kind of sticks out to you the most?
Certainly, yeah. So when understanding the composition of friendly forces and enemy forces, I will 12 times out of 10 take a numerically inferior force that is incredibly well trained, that is brutally trained. I want these guys sharp on their tactics. I want them, to have a good understanding of logistics. I want to empower them to make decisions, and they need to understand, the chain of command. These guys should, be foaming at the teeth to go and stack bodies. And through all of the hard workup and training that led to them getting to, the front of combat, they've earned each other's trust, and they're a cohesive unit. They have a strong will to fight. They've endured this very arduous training, And and ultimately, we need competent leaders. The gunny goes and he places incredible emphasis on the NCO core, and he returns to it constantly throughout the book. That the make or break factor of any military is who are your the mid level guys that are being enabled, that are giving authority, given resources because they have experience. And with the American military, we have this thing where, okay, the officers, only a small majority of them are Mustangs, prior enlisted guys. A lot of them are fresh out of whatever their commissioning source is. But usually, if you have an NCO, that guy's been around the block. He knows what it takes to win. And regardless of personal feelings, which that takes a little bit of nuance to understand the effectiveness of that. These NCOs need to be given free rein to conduct this training because of what's on the line. Their livelihood, the people they're responsible's livelihood, and it's something that can't be emphasized enough.
Yeah, and I'll actually break it down for the legionaries out there, Barney style, right? So the idea is this, is that there are two modes of warfare, and so too are there two modes of structuring your military force, right? Your strength. And I think the most glaring and most, I guess, salient example would be NATO versus Warsaw Pact doctrine. And recently I've been reading a lot more about Warsaw Pact than usual, but the idea is this: NATO focused on quality, excuse me. It focused on high technology, high training. So basically, one of ours is worth roughly 10 of theirs, right? We were focused on a professional force, a fighting force, a standing force. Whereas, on the contrary, the enemy, they wanted to leverage a conscript force. So what you do, so in the Soviet doctrine, the idea is that you'd have your mandatory military service depending on your arm or your branch. So for instance, if you're in the Navy, you have to stay in the military for 5 years, which is pretty good time, but if you're in the Army, you're in and out in like 2 or 3 years, tops, right? And obviously you and I both know what that kind of leads to. When you're in a place for only 2 or 3 years, yes, of course, that gives you a good foundational basis. However, especially the way they had it trained, or the training cycle was basically set up, was that you go from boot camp straight to your regiment. Your regiment was broken down basically into 6-month cycles of training, and so it was very repetitive, very basic, and ultimately what that meant for that Soviet force is that your average grunt on the enemy's side knew only a couple tricks, right, in their book. They were like 2-trick ponies at most, Whereas we had a professional force, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but our professional services, especially our NCO Corps, they're basically Swiss Army knives, right? They know everything. They know a lot of different things. They both know their MOS. They know the basic fundamentals. They're physically fit, mentally tough, all that good stuff. And the difference in emphasis is very, very important, because when we're going in and analyzing, for instance, conflicts of the future and ones that are being modeled out in the Ukraine, we have to understand where it is that there is a split in the trade-off, right? Because it's not like the enemy is crazy, right? It's not like the Soviets were dumb people or they were just doing it because they were broke. No, it's because the idea is that what they would do is basically understand that once you go into combat, losses are inevitable. And it's just as you elucidated, whether they're personnel, right? So people, your friends, your buddies die, or freaking logistical chain is impaired, or your basically equipment is worn, your ammunition is spent, beans, band-aids, bullets, all that stuff basically goes out the window. But what remains, right, is what you get. And so when I tell people, especially legionaries out there who are I'm trying to explain to them that losses are inevitable, but the way that you assess a loss to be worth it or a good investment will be what pieces did you gain from the enemy. How much damage did you incur for how much did you get? So how much bang for your buck did you use in that action, right? And
Hmm.
this is where the superiority of maneuver warfare, if I don't mind, if I don't mind saying so myself, makes itself known, right? Because attacking the machine gun nest head on is a pretty desperate move in some circumstances. Taking an objective by shock, which is what it's called,
Hmm.
is necessary, but not every time. Okay, and you want to avoid that as much as possible. But we have militaries out there in the world who have a special emphasis in the attack as a priority to attack by shock, and namely, that is what the Russians do nowadays, especially those countries of the CSTO, which is their NATO equivalent today, right? But what I'm trying to explain to you, Legionary who's listening, is basically you have to understand, especially when you read warfighting, you understand that war comes at a cost, but you shouldn't be paralyzed, right? Don't be worried about losing guys. Unfortunately, I know that sounds all honky dory when we're all cozy here talking over the mic, right? But you have to understand that when you're in war, you're already dead. So, but you have also the responsibility of making sure that with those human lives entrusted in your command, that you're making the most out of their lives. You're not just sending them needlessly into the crossfire, getting them killed over some harebrained idea. Now, transitioning back to your last point, and I'll ask you a question after this.
Hmm.
The NCO Corps, right? So it's interesting for those of you who don't know, the pattern in Warsaw Pact countries is that instead of the NCO Corps like we have here, which is the professional corps that is the subject matter expert. So for instance, if I grab a, E4 through, let's say, E9, right? They are masters. They're incredibly intelligent people. I mean, especially nowadays, they have masters and PhDs and whatever vocation they choose to dedicate themselves to. They know their area of expertise extremely well, but also they know the basic soldiering, discipline, all that good stuff. And the role of the officer in the modern military is primarily, of course, political control. I know this sounds like kind of anachronistic or idiosyncratic in the American's ear, but the reason why we have officers has less to do with competence and has everything to do with making sure that they control, the way I see it, these Dobermans, these bloodthirsty hounds, right? They want to crush the enemy, and the officer is there to obviously act in the how do you say, in the furtherance of the mission from the state, right? So the federal government or whatever government is employing the officer, right? So the state.
Hmm.
And in pattern, the Soviet pattern combines both these roles. So you get, Russian officers and officers basically from this tradition are actually the top tier officers of the world. Why? Because they combine all that expertise and knowledge. They go to military schools. Obviously, they did their conscript service, and then they would go to military school, and they're expected as officers to know their craft just as well as any NCO in the West, and also they have this responsibility of political and moral control, and the morale, and so on and so forth. This is actually one of the biggest issues that's been facing them in the Ukraine is that, well, what happens when your officer gets whacked? Then you got a whole bunch
Hmm.
of freaking chickens with their heads cut off that have no idea what's going on, right? Or
Hmm.
worse, especially if you read about this, and in war, this is reality, is that men, they become demoralized, mutinous, they commit crimes, rape, murder, all this kind of stuff, outside the purview of the officer, and so discipline breaks down. The great thing and the reason why the Western pattern, NATO pattern of the kind of delegation of power, right, and responsibility between the NCO and the officer corps is that it basically checks each other, and also if one gets whacked or the other gets whacked, there's always a replacement or a counterbalance, right? So officers are pretty well trained in the West still. I think they could do a better job, but they're still pretty well trained. And what I would like to say is that, effectively, if your platoon sergeant, your whatever senior NCO gets, buys the barn, you got someone that is immediately below them that will fill their boots, but also you have officers who know enough of their job to step in. Whereas that's not the same thing happening in the Russian pattern of warfare. But anyway, let's go ahead and zoom past. Unless you have any last comments or concerns, let's zoom past to the next section here.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and so to build upon that and move forward, the gunny goes and says, NCOs must love initiative and must hold what ground they have gained to the utmost. And all of that kind of leads itself to his next point of knowing what to do versus being able. And then he talks into the probability of the knowing what to do and being able. But it's a perfect segue because initiative is probably one of the most desired, besides discipline, attributes in the military. You could go and ask anybody, and whoever their top NCOs officers are, or even the junior enlisted, they're going to tell you in some form or fashion, yeah, hey, like this guy's squared away. He's disciplined. Oh, this guy does stuff without being told. He demonstrates initiative. And, that is enabled by, the chain of command, making sure that they can articulate, to the subordinates, what's the mission? What needs to be done? But that is also born out of, this knowing knowing what to do versus being able. We got to know our limitations in order to function as a cohesive team.
Yeah, and I mean, just to kind of add some thoughts that came to my mind is, capabilities and limitations, right? This is why you have in your 5-paragraph order ML-COOM, right? So your enemy's most likely course of action, but also this entailed in the, or excuse me, is it METTC actually?
METTC.
METTC. Yeah, so the idea would be basically you understand the capability and limitation of your enemy, but you also understand yourself. What the capabilities of your friends are, your friendly units, right? So, how much ammunition, how much gas in the tank, both physically or morally, and I don't mean like morally as a good boy thing. I mean like how much fight do you have in your heart, and how much fight do your friends have in their hearts to make an objective happen, and so on and so forth, right? Do you have an egress route? Do you have good planning? Do you have supporting elements to your left and your right? Do you know the battlefield? How much awareness do you have, and so on and so forth, right? And this is all going and feeding into the real-time calculus of the choices that you make on the battlefield when things are popping off, right? When there's rounds downrange going down, freaking artillery's coming down. I guess now UAVs, killer drones are freaking killing people all over the place, right? And you have to be able to, with imperfect information, make those decisions, be decisive. However, it's just like discipline, just as NAMOR alluded to, initiative, right? Initiative. But what is initiative? It's more than simply acting without having to be asked to do an order, right? The way that I would explain initiative to someone is when it comes to obeying, right? So you have a higher up, so you're like, let's say you're in some kind of command and you're sitting around twiddling your thumbs, waiting for another command to come down the pipeline. You shouldn't be waiting. You should never be in a case where you're doing jack unless you're being ordered to do so, right? And the way that you get around this is by thinking to yourself, okay, let's put myself in the boots of my superior. What would they tell me next? For instance, my bricks. Is my barracks room squared away? Okay, it's squared away. Tight. No problem. Check. I'm still waiting for orders. No problem. Let me help out my buddies. That goes down. And then you think to yourself, okay, let's look around the barracks room. Let's see if there's anything I can fix. Let me see if there's anything off my superior's plate that I can take off, right? And Patton actually was able to explain to officers how leadership should be. your NCOs, your command should be so aggressive, default initiative, decisiveness, discipline, so much so that the higher up you go, the less you do. He wants to be able to just tell you, hey, get X done, and you go get it done. You figure out how, right? And that's what I would kind of explain to you what initiative is, right? From a followership, or how to be a good follower, how to be a good subordinate in the chain of command. But what is initiative on the battlefield? How do you wrestle this from the enemy, right? From someone who has hostile intent. Well, the way that you do it, and the way that you figure out that you have the initiative, is by placing the enemy in such a position through actions, basically through a volume of actions, that you make the enemy react to you. And what does that mean necessarily? It means that you're basically forcing the enemy to, at great cost, force him on the defensive, right? Because if he were to take an offensive action, it would be a kill shot for you. And you can see this in boxing, for instance, right? Let's say, like, there's a reason why you have combinations, right? So you have jab, jab, hook. Well, the deal is that maybe you could eat a couple jabs and still punch, but the thing is, the jab is stealing the initiative from the person receiving it, because if you were to do that, you're so disoriented from being able to actually land a good hook on the enemy that when they respond with that 1-1-3, right, on that 3, they knock you out, right? And so the idea is, in war and, on the battlefield or in a fight, you want to make sure that the enemy is responding to you. You want them to be on the defensive. You want them to be waiting for you to attack, and so on and so forth. So default aggressive. But did you have anything to add to that?
Oh yeah, certainly. So the gunny goes and he frames this in a very great way. He says winning consistently requires decisive and aggressive response. And diving into that, he goes and he further says, complex versus simple. Are you looking to destroy the enemy or break the will? As some of the larger topics, in the pursuit of that victory.
Explain. Why don't you go ahead and tell the legionaries the dichotomy, the difference between destroying the enemy and breaking his will? Because I think people think those two things are one and the same, but I'm sure you know very well that that's not the case. So why don't you go ahead and go into that?
Yeah. So, kind of dialing back to the cost of winning, you need to define that. To have a good understanding of your mission. What is that from the higher headquarters? Like, we need to win in XX such a manner. Well, okay, cool. Is this going to be a complex victory? Is it a simple victory? And as you go and define that, like what the gunny was faced with the guerrilla warfare with communism in Vietnam, are we trying to destroy the enemy, or are we trying to break their will? And what are the associated costs to each of those pursuits? Like, okay, cool. Yeah, we could stack bodies, from sun up to sundown to sun up again. Is that really going to do any good against, a force that's been brainwashed into a certain ideology? Or, are we going to win if we, kind of use maneuver warfare in a metaphorical sense? And we get into these minds and we break their will. And there's a time and a place for each of these tactics. Like, yeah, sure, there are times when, dude, you need to put bodies on pikes and burn them in front of the Capitol so everybody can see, hey, this is what we're capable of, and willing, most importantly, willing to do to achieve this victory. This isn't, a detrimental cost. However, maybe sometimes it's something a little bit more subtle, but infinitely more complex to break somebody's will and win, that minds and hearts, so to speak.
Yep. No, exactly. And I think just to kind of further elucidate with real-time examples, right? Case studies, right? So case study for breaking the will is Desert Storm 91, right? because even though, yes, we were overmatched, we overmatched the enemy, and we were able to basically crush a lot of the enemy, right? Liquidate a bunch of them. The way that we were able to do so was mostly because of surrenders. We were actually able to show them such shock and awe, which is actually a part of the doctrine of superiority of fires, that we kind of convinced the conventional force of the Iraqi army that they were just simply so overwhelmed and overmatched that there was just simply no way that they could overcome the coalition forces, right? Vice, for instance, when you're fighting communists, right? These communists are brainwashed people. Excuse me, they're not even people. But what I'm trying to get at is that at base, what is the communist? The communist has ceased to be a person. It is like a prion. It's like a virus. And unfortunately, with that kind of virus, you need to completely liquidate that threat. You see that with wars of attrition, such as Vietnam, like you so aptly chose, and how difficult it was to gain people to our side, or rather difficult to, convince people of the benefits of Japs' military junta in South Vietnam. And so ultimately there was one choice, which is completely liquidate Charlie. Hence why there was this emphasis on body count, right? Which is something that's rather quote-unquote infamous. It's not really infamous. It's pretty normal. And you'd see this with Tamerlane, for instance. When Tamerlane took over Baghdad, the reason why the Mongols were so successful in their conquests was, of course, they were genius military strategists and great warriors in their own right. However, they were so brutal that that basically, you would just simply surrender because you know that the cost of resisting was too much. And for instance, Tamerlane, when he went into Baghdad, he killed everyone because they resisted, and he made a massive pile of heads in the Baghdad square in the center of the city, and that caused so much terror. The story of terror came from that conquest, that the Turks and the Mongols were able to conquer vast swaths of the Arab Levantine region.
Well, they went and pulled one of the senior leaders, and they poured liquid silver into his eye sockets in the public square too, which was a phenomenal move on their part as they pushed eastward.
Precisely.
Or westward, sorry.
And this is why the Romans, for instance, when they crushed the slave rebellion by Spartacus, they made mile markers out of their bodies, right? This is why they crucified people. And this is one of the valuable lessons that I keep on telling people. It's barbarous and stuff like that, and whatever. For you who are Christians out there, maybe close your ears because your little girls.
I'm closing my ears.
What I'd like to say is that ultimately you have to be able to exact that kind of vengeance on the enemy, that kind of reprisal on the enemy. Otherwise, your threat isn't real, right? That's why no one fears the United States, because they know that we're a bunch of softies when it comes to worrying about collateral damage and humanism and all this crap, right? So they know that we have quit and they don't. They're willing to have all their family die for whatever it is that they're trying to fight for. And you can see the outcome of that kind of stratagem, right? We lost a 20-year conflict both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Iraq obviously ceased to be Ba'athist, but now it's a proxy of Iran, okay? And then Afghanistan is still Taliban. So, I mean, who won, really? At the end of the day, you have to be willing to do some pretty freaking heinous stuff to win a conflict. But, without further ado, let's move on and get to the next section here.
Yeah, sure. So, in the next section, he addresses old habits may get in the way, and he again kind of references this idea of balancing your dichotomies. But there's a fantastic point that he makes at the end of it, which was manuals and history books do not contain definitive guidelines on how squads can resolve such dilemmas during combat, and what that means in present day speak is hey, just because we did stuff and it worked means it's going to continue to work. The whole if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's so much more deeper than that, because of this emphasis on manuals and history books. There are a lot of folks who are great readers and academics, but hey, good for you, brother. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean anything at the end of the day.
Yep.
It's absolutely worthless. Because if you go and you sit in front of information that is presented to you through a briefing, through a printed out document, or even if it's some type of briefing, what matters is, are all of your atoms in your mind, are they firing at all cylinders, processing this stuff and seeking ways in which to apply for whatever your next objective is? Okay, cool. Hey, Sarge was talking about, maneuver warfare, and, we're going to train on, doing a raid. Okay, cool. Well, how does a raid differ from, from the ambush that I learned, last month or whatever? It's again, stuff that I had said earlier. It's stuff you have to do.
Well,
you can't sit. Yeah, you can't sit on, you can't rest on your laurels. Oh, I read it and I understood it. But yeah, over to you, bro.
Yeah, no, it's it's deeper than that, right? It's the idea that basically that war and its various forms is mercurial. It's dynamic, right? It's like a fire. It's not like stone, and you see this often, especially when it comes to doctrine writing and all this kind of stuff. Just because something worked in 1940, for instance, doesn't mean it works now, right? Because the circumstances change. So, a practical example for you who are listening. A practical example is blitzkrieg, right? What we call, maneuver warfare, right? So combined arms, maneuver warfare, concentration of forces at decisive points of the battlefield of the enemy to, encircle and basically finish the enemy. Well, that's proving to be very difficult in the modern era. Why? Why? Because ISR and the ability to recon the operational and strategic battlefield to the point where you can count individual tanks, in storage and out in the battlefield, so you're able to see from a mile off concentration of forces. And so what does this mean is that basically maneuver warfare is becoming increasingly difficult. Why? Because you can preempt where the enemy is coming from, because it takes a lot more time to prepare for an attack than it does, prepare to attack than it does prepare to defend, right? Because you can just sit in the defense and then figure out, oh, the enemy's massing over here, let me quickly go over there and just start digging, as you saw with, for instance, the Surovikin line in preparation for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, right, which failed, right? And so what I'm trying to tell you, Legionary, is that basically it is all well and good, and it is extremely important, and this is why General Mattis talks about how you must be a constant reader, especially if you're a leader of men, is because ultimately, yes, it is the case that there are rules of thumb, but remember, they're rules of thumb. They're not absolutes. And so the reason why we read and become perspicacious, and it's a continuous thing, and it's something that you must act on and train for and be ready for and constantly go back again, especially when it comes to fundamentals. Fundamentals are not something you just read once or do once or practice once and then you just call it quits. I mean, it's just like going to the gym, right? You don't just go to the gym once and you're jacked. No. You go and go again and keep on reading the same thing. So, one tack 3, you read freaking last 100 yards. You read the foundational texts, which are absolutely essential. You learn from the fundamentals, so that way when you're in the battlefield, you're able to maybe not follow it word by word, but you're able to reorient that mental shape, that little tool they gave you in your head, for the situation at hand, for the challenge at hand, right? And so, you just got to make sure that you're thinking dynamically, that you're thinking in a quicksilver kind of way. You're not thinking like a stone, right? So get away from doctrinal thinking. Get away from mathematical formulae to stuff. There's no such thing as mathematical formulae. War is it's a fluid game. It's almost like soccer. You know what I mean? It's like this
Mm.
fluid back and forth. But anyway, why don't we go ahead and progress to the next bullet point?
Yeah, awesome. So then the next thing that he covers, in a large sense, is kind of expanding on what common sense is in the Force, um, and what how he decides to proceed with the definition of that is which style of warfare is least costly. And so a few points on that that he talks about is he actually, like, at this point in the book, he gets into the analysis of the populace that are involved in the conflict. So he looks at Eastern culture versus Western culture, their militaries, how they view the various echelons of people, how they implement their version of maneuver warfare. But then he returns to the Western, in the Marines in particular, and he goes and says, attack where the enemy isn't, and will always be costly than to attack where he is. It is not, to attack where the enemy is not. Sorry, I misread. I misread my notes. To attack where the enemy is not will always be less costly than to attack where he is. Another great point that he had with that is, to what extent is modern warfare accepted in the country today, and implying that by some that it violates the U.S. Code of Honor. Far too often, and, especially because of the various things that you've talked about, folks got their panties in a bunch over footage of the Russia-Ukraine war, and that wasn't warfare back in the day when it was honorable. And it's like, brother, like, you have no idea, like, warfare by far and large, has never been. The contest of wills is literally that. If they're in the idea of the pursuit of a gentleman's code to make sure that there was a quote fair competition, is a very it's a very worthless effort, because it's nations are on, their livelihoods are on the line.
I keep telling people this is that the only rule of war is to win. Okay, that's the only law.
Yeah, exactly.
And checks on each other's behavior. So, for instance, World War II, we didn't see gas, right? Chlorine gas deployed in the battlefield. I mean, aside from the fact that it just simply wasn't it didn't tactically make sense in a war which had mechanized warfare and so on. But where the lines weren't static like they were in World War I, which would make sense, right? And of course, chlorine gas is an extremely, I don't know how you'd say it, it's like an unwieldy weapon. You're worried that this shit's going to start drifting in your way. You don't know where the wind's blowing, whatever. My point that I'm trying to make is that ultimately it's not because gentlemen, we had a gentleman's agreement, we wouldn't do X, Y, and Z. It's not this joust. It's not a game. War is not a freaking game. A lot of people are dying, men and women, children dying. We're not here to pull punches just because, it kind of turns your stomach to do a certain thing. It doesn't matter. And whenever I see silly things on the internet, like how cruel one side or the other is, it's like it's so ludicrous to me, because at the end of the day, both sides are cruel. We are cruel. I mean, people don't know this, but we killed over 3 million, or caused the deaths of 3 million innocent men, women, and children over 20 years. Okay, like in GWAT. Like, you people need to grow the fuck up. And at the end of the day, that's the conflict that you're waging. But what I'm trying to get at, is that the only thing that's a check to behavior is this thing called escalation, right? It's basically a political concept, which you don't want to be going balls to the wall, crushing someone, doing unspeakable things to them out the gate, Why? Because ultimately you want to induce the enemy to be subdued, right? You don't want the enemy to fight you at any cost because they're so outraged. And so,
Hmm.
why am I saying this? I'm saying that the check to behavior, or rather the check to extreme action, whatever it may be, is dependent on what you seek to gain and what the stakes are. So if the stakes are basically you will freaking have everyone in your family is going to get killed if you lose, you're about to do some extremely dirty stuff to make sure that you live, right? But if it's about some expeditionary conflict out in the middle of nowhere, like the Banana Wars, or early 1900s, the United States was in the Philippines, and it was just like out in the middle of nowhere fighting people, then you can afford to be this Mr. Nice Guy obeying the rules of war and all this BS and this crap, right? But don't let these lawyers and these liberals and these communists try to brain fuck you into thinking that war is anything but the complete extirpation of the enemy, right? Whether you're subduing him or you're destroying him, ultimately it's about completely dominating the enemy at any cost.
Hmm.
And any regulation of that behavior has to come down to being shrewd as opposed to being moral, quote unquote. But I know that's going to raise some hairs and be upset to some people, but make some people upset. But that's the unfortunate truth, and that's why war is such a very important thing to be left to important people, right? Because you have human lives in your hand when it comes down to it. But anyway, next
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I guess, for our final thing here, is, the gunny, he speaks to that, and he goes and he emphasizes, those actions that are taken by our units, and, kind of, building on, this idea of momentum. It's, momentum is something that it supersedes tactics, operations, or strategy. It's something, kind of elusive, and you really just have to be there to sense it and know if you have it or don't. But it's very incumbent on timelines, because as long as you do something prior to the enemy expecting it, then you can shift the tide of battle. It doesn't matter if it was 8 seconds, if it was 8 hours, if it was 8 months, if it was 8 years. If you do something before the enemy expects it, you've gone and really dug your heels in the dirt and started pushing against them in order to impose your will, as you said. And he goes and he expands on this. So how do you get momentum? What's required of this? Well, you have to be impetuous people and require special training and patience. You attain speed through rehearsal. And this is all driven by technique and doctrine, a dichotomy. You need to know the disposition, yourself, your teammates. He references, the Maneuver Warfare Handbook. The maneuver warfare demands excellence in techniques, but it demands more in creativity and in originality in selecting from among and combining techniques. So in that, we learn reflexes, we learn preparations to survive, we learn intent, we learn follow-ups, assessments, questions of the various levels of our chain of command, between the senders and the receivers. And this constant emphasis of practicing. You need to practice maneuver warfare, because that ultimately is going to empower people, and it makes control decentralized, which allows for the greater chances of success and winning at low cost.
Yeah, I mean, you know what the interesting thing is, and this is why I think Europors are the worst, is that basically, did you know that their militaries don't drill on combined arms basically they don't. You know how you have field exercises, you have battalion level field exercises.
Yeah.
The European militaries rarely do anything at a battalion size level, and as you're
Oof.
seeing in Ukraine, that is the bread and butter, my friend. Battalion
Mm.
minimum, right? But you need to be on the brigade level doing drill. The only people that are actually doing that are the Americans, right? But the Americans can't freaking wipe their nose and clean their ass for the Europeans to figure their stuff out. And
Hmm.
which is why it's so essential that militaries around the world are practicing what they pretend, what they are trying to go to war with, right? So it's not going to be good when you have to figure out day of, okay, how do I do a divisional level attack? How do I coordinate freaking supporting fires? How do I coordinate? Imagine the staff. Imagine that they're going to lose their freaking minds. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So ultimately, make sure that you're habituating yourself to, and this is on the small unit level as well, that you're basically getting in tune with the rest of your team. And this is why I think it's so important. People really overlook the human dimension to syncing with your comrades, right? It's basically, you're supposed to be spending all your time with your boys. Why? Because you start almost like syncing up with them on a biological level. You start understanding them so deeply that you know what they're thinking when rounds are going down range. You kind of like just understand what these guys are thinking at this very moment, right?
Hmm.
And that's absolutely essential. But I mean, let's. I think maybe we've been going a little bit for too long, and I'll
Yeah.
definitely have you back on here, Namor, because we want to talk about these things. These are the fundamentals, the bread and butter that we want to make sure we're harping on. But do you have
Mm.
any last comments, concerns, questions, any things that you want to tell the Legionaries as a parting thought?
Yeah. Whatever little wisdom I can push out there. The emphasis on the NCOs for the guys that are in the military. And if you're considering it, hey, go for it. I encourage it. But understand that there is, regardless of what your walk of life is, there is this dichotomy between maybe I'll say like expertise or experience and certification. And we see this often in the military, especially with officers and NCOs. And just make sure that you stay humble. You can learn from anybody, and that ability to detach yourself from whatever your current organization is and learn from the people who have been around the block, regardless of how much more intelligent you may be, that will make you a more effective team.
Yep, absolutely. And I think this is part of the reason why I'm doing Lance's Legion, right? This is, I mean, all jokes aside, persona aside, a lot of people I see, especially with the officer class, they want to just show up to work like it's a 9 to 5 and, forget about it. A lot of people are not even interested. And so it's important that you're doing PME, right? Professional military education on your off time. You make sure that you eat, breathe, and live this shit, right? To the point that you become, a person because all you think about is these things. And with people like Namor and innumerable other guys who are sharing their expertise, make sure you're listening. Make sure that you're dedicating yourself to the craft every day. That you're not resting on your laurels because they say that the only easy day is yesterday, but what I'm trying to tell you is that yesterday doesn't exist. You have to put in the work every day, just like you put in the work at the gym every day or when you read every day. And so this is not just simply a vocation, this is a calling. And being a modern leader, a modern warrior, soldiering and so on, this is a continuous effort, and you have to be constantly putting yourself out there and trying to learn and act on these things that we're talking about. Not simply knowing of them, but acting on them and practicing them. Well, without further ado, thank you so much, Namor, for coming on, and I'll definitely have you back on the show. We'll be talking more about this, about some esoteric texts and fundamentals in the future. But thank you so much, brother. I appreciate you for coming on.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a great conversation, and I appreciate you having me, man.
It his honor. All right. Well, thank you so much. This is obviously Sergeant Barnes in the background, menacingly drinking his whiskey. He already reads too much. No, he doesn't read at all. I'm just kidding. But anyway, we're here in the command post out in the Laotian Mountains, fighting, trying to find Charlie. And thank you so much. This is War Room with General Lance signing off. Oh!